Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal, some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. I'm going to stop there. And I do think that we covered this material briefly at the end of class, but I want us to talk about it a tiny bit more. So Noah begins. The very first thing he does when he gets off the ark, and this is very commendable, by the way, I believe, for him. Again, I've never been in that situation. I'm not sure how I would respond, but knowing me and knowing how I've responded in other kind of situations, I think the first thing I'd be concerned about is myself and securing for myself a place that was safe and securing for myself the things that I needed and enjoying as much as I can being back on dry land. But the first thing that he does is build an altar to the Lord and offer sacrifices. And we see at least the reason why God had more of the clean animals brought upon the ark than he did the unclean animals, because it says that Noah took of all the clean animals that he brought on, some of all, and offered sacrifices. Now, why did he do that? Do we find anywhere in here that God told Noah to offer sacrifices? So why would he do it?
Well, we know that the sacrifices have been a part of worship since Cain and Abel even, right, were sacrificed
Right.
to worship God. And so clearly he was thankful for preservation and wanting to praise God for what he'd done.
Exactly. I think that's the thing. We know that animal sacrifices date at least all the way back to Cain and Abel. Maybe even before Cain and Abel, but at least to Cain and Abel. And we know that that was a part of worship. We don't know whether or not God instructed Noah. That's something that we want to make clear. The silence of the Scriptures does not authorize, but it also doesn't what? It doesn't do anything is what it doesn't do. It doesn't give us any reason to believe or tell us that God didn't do this thing. It's just silent about it. There was a reason God asked for more clean animals. I think we see the reason for that at this stage, because if there had only been two of each kind, and even one of each was offered on the sacrifice, could they have been fruitful and multiply after that? No. And so all the clean animals would have been gone. They had to have enough to pair off and have offspring. And so that's at least part of the reason why. But we know that Noah was a righteous man, and that means that Noah worshiped God, and that means that Noah had offered sacrifices to God throughout his life. And we're now 600 years into his life, and the first thing that he does when he has opportunity is he offers worship to God. And that's something that I think is worth our consideration. He didn't set out and build a house for himself. He got off the ark and he set out to build an altar to worship God. What was preeminent in Noah's mind? Fast forward to Matthew 6 in verse 33 in the teaching of Jesus. What did Jesus say there? Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. That tells us that Noah actually sought God first. That God was more important to Noah than Noah was. He didn't build a house for his wife. He built an altar to God. He spent his time, he spent his effort, he spent his work, he spent some of the scarce resources that they had, and offered a sacrifice to God. The fear of you, and let's see, back up. The Lord, it said, smelled the pleasing aroma, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. All right. Did God respond favorably to his worship? And what is implied here is that God's decision to not again destroy man in this fashion began with Noah's worship. Noah worshiped, God was pleased, and said, I will never again. And so that's an important thing for us to realize. Does our worship matter to God? Yes. We talk about this, or at least I talk about this a lot. The actual value of corporate worship is ours. God doesn't get anything from it in terms of something that he needs from us. The things that he's asked us to do are to benefit ourselves. They're to help us remember, they're to help us know, they're to help us learn, they're to help us grow. But we need to realize that God does gain pleasure from worship. He gains pleasure from our corporate worship, but even more importantly, he gains pleasure from our personal devotion, from our personal recognition to him. And so much so that because of Noah's faithfulness in this act, God says, you know what? I'm not going to destroy the earth in this way. Would you do me a huge favor? Walk in that room and click off the pump. That's what that whining is. And I saw people looking, and so it's drawing people's attention away. So we need to fix that. So we actually gain benefit from Noah's worship. And we're going to see that and why that is, or why I say that, as we continue to read in a moment. But even at what we've already read here, I will never again curse the ground because of man. We're still the recipients of the benefit of that. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Now, there's some important things, I think, to talk about this. I know we talked about this last time. It doesn't say from his conception. It doesn't say from his birth. It says from his youth. And so I would tell you that this doesn't have anything to do with the nature of man. It has everything in the world to do, however, with the character and behavior of man. And that while we are yet youths, we make decisions to rebel and to do things contrary to what we're taught. And we're just going to do that. And so we need to keep that in mind. That also means for me and you something. If I'm aware of that now, that from my youth I am given to evil, then what does that mean about me in life and things that I ought to be doing today? Okay, it's not the pump. It must be I don't know what that is. Now I'm worried. What does that mean? If I know that man is given to evil from his youth, what should that say to me about myself? I need to watch myself. And I'm going to have to work. I'm going to have to work hard to do what's right. It's easier or more likely for me to turn to do what's wrong than it is for me to do what's right. And that tells me that I'm going to have to work and work hard. That also tells me how hard Noah had worked. Because he lived in a time when there was only evil continually on the earth, and he managed to be righteous in his time and receive grace and favor from God because of it. And this whole story tells me, therefore, that I have no excuse. We're going to talk about this a little bit more this morning, so I don't want to go into it a whole lot, but I have no excuse, therefore, for practicing evil. If Noah can survive in the circumstances, in the situation that he was in, and be righteous, be blameless in his time, I certainly have no excuse for being given to evil. As bad as it may seem, it's not nearly as bad now as it was in Noah's day. There's more than 8 righteous souls on the face of the earth. And by the way, the Bible's pretty clear about this. Those other 7 people were delivered primarily because Noah found favor. So you could generally make the argument that there was one righteous man on the earth. And we're not yet in that kind of condition. So how hard did Noah have to work to remain righteous and focused on God? I have to work at that like he did. There's lots of little subtle lessons in here that we shouldn't look past. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. I'm not sure exactly what the burning flesh and fat of animals smelled like, but we probably wouldn't call it pleasing. I know the flesh of humans burning doesn't smell pleasant. Sometimes cooking certain meats smell pleasing, but when they start burning, it ceases to be pleasing. This is not so much talking about the actual odor of the smoke, because it probably didn't reach to heaven anyway. What is this talking about? Noah's heart and God's response to what Noah did. It's not a matter of whether or not we actually do something that in some way serves God. God's pleased by what we do. He wasn't necessarily pleased at the... I think that stands for... The smoke stands for the worship behind the smoke. And God was pleased with that. And so is God pleased when we worship Him? If we do it according to His will. By the way, that was the lesson we learned back with Cain and Abel, right? That there was a way to worship that displeased God if you don't do what He asked. But the solution that was given to Cain was, just do what's right, and you'll be accepted as well. And so, doing what God has asked brings God pleasure and develops a relationship between us and God that is in our interest. So He's pleased with this sacrifice, and He decides, I will never again curse the earth or curse the ground because of man. Neither will I ever strike down every living creature as I have done. I'm alive because of Noah's worship. Because if God struck down every living creature that transgressed His law, I wouldn't be here today. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. We talked about that a little bit more last time. Listen, the earth does function in cycles. Yes, there's fluctuations. Yes, things change. But it will always be cold and hot. It will always be summer and winter. It will always be seedtime and harvest as long as the earth remains. I'm not worried about those things ceasing to happen. There's a promise here. that they're not going to. And so, might we worry about some things? Yeah, we might worry about some things, but we need not concern ourselves with the season stopping because of anything. Are the plants producing food stopping because of anything? Are there temporary things that affect that? Yeah, the balance of the Bible talks about it constantly. Various periods of famine and various periods of drought and various periods of all kinds of things that can happen. You also have the other extreme that can happen where there can be too much water and things die because of that. Yes, those things happen, but they're always going to be what? They're always going to be temporary. And they're always going to be localized. And so we need to keep that in mind. That's part of this promise. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." This is exactly what was said to things right after creation. "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered." That last statement is just as important as all the rest of it, because it tells us that when he said the fear of you, that wasn't just a reactionary response that he was talking about. He was giving dominion to men over creatures. And anytime you get authority given to you by God, what comes along with it? Responsibility. Responsibility regarding how you use it. And I don't think that we really think about that enough. That humanity has some responsibility regarding this earth. "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you." This is different. This is different than what had been the case from creation until this day. At the end of creation, when we get to the end of that story, what does God say is their food? Every green plant and its produce and its seeds, and also they ate fruits and vegetables and nuts and greens. And now he says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. And so he opens up what? The consumption of meat. And I have heard brethren who are a lot more educated and smarter than me in these areas speculate as to why he did that. It doesn't say why he did it, so I don't bother teaching about why he did it. But he did it. And, by the way, this is a distinct command from what he commanded the Israelites under the law of Moses. And what I want you to understand is that when he gave the law to the Israelites, the balance of the earth still functioned under this. So the Gentiles still had every living creature as food for them. It was only the Israelites who had a restricted, controlled diet by God. Some people restricted and controlled their diets themselves, but that wasn't from God. There are certain things that I will not eat. Because of this, I believe that they probably can be eaten, but I have no real interest in eating them. "But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood." Now, whether this is saying that food must be cooked before you eat it or not, I'm not sure about that. I think what it's saying is that you shouldn't eat it while it's living and its blood is still coursing through its veins. Just to settle everybody in their concerns, that pale red liquid in the plate with your steak is not blood. That animal has already been bled clean. This is not a prohibition from eating rare meat. It's not a prohibition, I don't believe, from eating steak tartare. I think it's a prohibition from being animalistic and just grabbing a living animal and beginning to chew on its neck until we've satisfied ourselves. We're not to handle life that way. And we're going to see that that's really what he's talking about as he continues to move through this. The value of life is what's actually under consideration here. Your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning for your lifeblood. So he's really talking about life here. From every beast I will require it, and from man, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. There is value to life. I want you to understand that. And so as a result of the way you treat animals, despite the fact that I've given you dominion over them and I've given them to you for food, you still treat their life with respect. And I'm going to require a reckoning for your life. From every beast and from man, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. This is about the value of life. And it was even more important the day that it was uttered, because there weren't very many animals around. And if they had just indiscriminately killed them for no good reason, what would have happened? It would have been impossible for them to fill the earth and multiply and do the things that God wanted done. But beyond that, he explains that really this is about learning to treat the life of man with respect, because man was created in the image of God. And so he prescribed this very serious consequence for indiscriminately taking human life. By man, the life of the one that does it is required to be taken. Both, I believe, of beast is under suggestion here, and by man. If you have an animal that is killing human beings, God says that the way to deal with that animal is to take its life. And if you have a human being that's killing human beings indiscriminately, God says that the way to deal with that human being is what? By taking his life, or her life. And so we go back to the question that pops up every once in a while of things like capital punishment. Is it wrong to administer capital punishment? What's the answer to that question? It came from God. It can't be wrong. And what I also want us to understand as we go through this, and we're going to keep reading this goes through verse 17. This is all covering the covenant that God made with man after the flood. We're going to see that this entire covenant is still in force today. And so unless there is a direct statement made somewhere else to tell us that the principle set forth here doesn't apply, then guess what? We know that it does. And if all flesh is still food for us, and if I'll never again curse the ground because of man, and if I'll never again flood the earth in this way, if those tenets of this covenant are still in force, then so is whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, is still in force. We don't get to pick and choose what aspects of this covenant apply. God gave the covenant, and if he changes it, he'll let us know. And so it's important that we realize that what he's actually trying to get us to do is understand the value of life, particularly understand the value of human life. And in the coming chapters, as man begins to repopulate the earth, we see that they're not replenishing the full earth the way that God wanted them to do. They're all staying in one place. And so he has to do something about that. That comes along in chapter 11. And we read the story of what happens at the Tower of Babel and the confusion of the languages and the separating people to different parts of the world. This right here says that all human life is valuable. It doesn't say whoever sheds the blood of people from this land. It says whoever sheds man's blood. And again, this is talking about the indiscriminate, unjustified killing of human beings. The price that God set down for that is life for life. If that's the way I'm going to behave, if I'm going to have no respect for the people that God created in His image, and I'm going to take their life for no reason, God says that the way that the rest of mankind should deal with me is to take my life. Notice verse 7. And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly in the earth and multiply in it. When life is respected, that can happen. When life is not respected, it can't. By the way, this also addresses the other grave evil of humanity, and that is attacking life in the womb. When we have no respect for human life, we can't be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Abortion is every bit as much the indiscriminate, unjustified taking of human life as any other murder is. We have to have more respect for life than that. And again, this hasn't changed. He hasn't come along again somewhere else and told us and revealed to us, I know I said that then, but things have changed now. He doesn't do that. God said to Noah and his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you, your offspring after you. Guess who's a part of the offspring of Noah? That's going to become pretty clear. With every living creature that's with you, the birds and livestock and every beast of the earth that's with you, as many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. Listen, this covenant goes beyond humanity. This covenant is made with man for the benefit of all living things. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off of the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Again, if that principle of the covenant is enforced, so is everything else from the covenant. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations, for most future generations, for generations until it stops, for 100 generations. No, it says for all future generations. Is the covenant still in force? I've set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The language of verse 14 is very important to me because we tend to look at the bow in the clouds, the rainbow, and we recall this covenant, and I think we should. But do you notice that the language here, God says, when it happens, I'll look upon it. and I'll remember this covenant. We have to remember where the real power lies. The real power lies with God, not with us. Could Noah have stopped the flood? No. Do you notice that there's no suggestion that God's judgment was going to stop in any of this? There's only the way of escape from God's judgment that's provided. The power is all in God's hand. When Noah built the ark and went onto the ark, what if God hadn't shut the door? What if God hadn't made the ark float? What if God hadn't preserved them through the storms? People die on the seas all the time. We're not made to live in the water. The power always lies with God. I've set my bow in the cloud. It shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth. Notice God saying this. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. So that's what we need to do, by the way. When we see the bow in the clouds, we need to be grateful to God that He is continuing to honor His covenant to not destroy us. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that's on the earth. The everlasting covenant. When's this covenant going to end? The only thing that's going to end this covenant is when God brings this entire order to an end. When there is no more earth for Him to preserve. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that's on the earth." By virtue of the fact that we still have rainbows to this day, we know that this covenant is still in force, that God is still remembering this covenant, and that we are still to respect it and respect our responsibilities underneath it. And at the core of this covenant is valuing life. Yes, you can eat animals, but don't just kill them indiscriminately. And don't treat them as invaluable. They have life. So you don't just take them and eat them with their lifeblood. And if anything takes human life for no reason, then man has an obligation to do what? To execute justice. You know what? We don't do that all the time. And as a result of that, the value and respect for life has gone down lower and lower and lower. And we start deciding that some life is more valuable than other life. That some life deserves to be preserved and other life we don't care about. And we need to watch that as well. It's never okay to try to become the master of life. Who's the master of life? God. Therefore, if we take life, we had better have a God-given reason to do it. We have the reason to do it for our food. We have the reason to do it as a disciplinary action against those who indiscriminately take human life. Otherwise, we need to respect all life. We're going to pick up, if the Lord wills, in verse 18, which begins kind of another section. That's kind of the end of the covenant discussion. And we get into this section about Noah's descendants. We're going to go probably not through the entire genealogy section, we may. But we're going to look at chapter 10 next week, and then we'll move on to other places in the Scriptures where this narrative plays an important role in our understanding and grasping of things. Thank you for your presence this morning. For me. So the instructions that he gave are important when we consider what it means to follow Jesus. And that's what we're doing on Sunday mornings, is considering how we follow Jesus. So we're going to ask the question this morning, what was Jesus saying about the way that you and I are supposed to live life when he uttered these words about specks and logs in our eyes? How would we take that if we were on the street and we were walking along and there was a crowd of people around someone, and that person was standing there and discoursing to folks? And keep in mind that we're religious people and we're devout to the law of Moses, and maybe we're of that strictest sect, the Pharisees, and we are careful about how much we tithe and careful about so many little things. And we walk up there, and these are the words we hear. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but don't notice the log that's in your own eye? How are we going to take those words? What is that going to mean to us? How do you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. Again, keep in mind, you're just listening to someone on the street. And you're a devout follower of God and believe that you're among the strictest of the followers of God, that you care about things that other people don't care about. And he says, you hypocrite. You're a play actor. You're pretending to be a follower of God. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. What does it mean when we hear those words? Often, human beings are blind to our own mistakes. And Jesus is explaining to people who would be followers of God, people who would be religious, people who want to associate themselves with him, that we're often blind to our own mistakes. That we don't see the log in our own eye when we do see the speck in our brother's eye. How can you see the speck in your brother's eye and completely miss a log in your own eye? And I want you to understand, don't get caught up on the speck and the log thing. Obviously, these are two extremes. This is like a tiniest of things and the largest of things that you can imagine. Some translations use the term beam. So we can think of a large log or a large beam, like the ones running up in the ceiling here, as compared to a tiny speck of dust. That's not his point in terms of the size. He's not saying that your sin is worse or their sin is less. That's not what he's saying at all. He's simply saying you need to realize something extremely important, and that is your sins are your biggest problem. We see all the problems of the people around us, and we completely miss our own faults. And then when our faults are brought out, we tend to play the blame game. But, listen, it's the oldest thing in the book. It goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. They ate of the fruit that God said not to eat. God approached Adam and said, why did you eat? And he said, it was the woman. You know what? He should have just said, I have sinned. But he didn't. He said, it's the woman that you gave me. And he turns to the woman, and she should have said, I have sinned. But she didn't. She said, it's a serpent. That's what we tend to do. Now, we might have a real complaint. In point of fact, Eve had in fact sinned, and Eve did in fact entice Adam to sin. And so he had a legitimate complaint, but what he didn't understand is that his own failures were a bigger issue for him than her problems. You see, despite what anyone else around me does, my mistakes are the bigger issue for me. They're the beam. Other people's mistakes are but specks compared. And again, we're talking about this, looking at it from a personal vantage point, how I should see things, what I should understand about life and about living. The process does not begin with me talking about other people's mistakes. Ezekiel 18:20 says, "The soul who sins shall die." That means that when I have transgressed, the most important thing in the world should be my transgression to me, irrespective of anything else around me. But that's not how we live our life. We tend to be hypercritical. We spotlight every single misstep of the people around us, and often we are doing that to hide our own issues. Our defensiveness kicks in when someone comes to us and raises a question about our issue. Hey, you've got a problem yourself. Let's talk about it. We become defensive and we point out the actions of everyone around us and how their actions are worse than our own. So we're trying to draw attention away from our mistake, and we're trying to diminish our mistakes and put the attention on someone else's mistake and exaggerate and make their mistake seem even bigger than it is, so that I'm not the problem. We have to stop looking past ourselves. That's the point of Jesus' teaching. We have to stop looking past ourselves. We have to accept our responsibility for our actions. We have to see our logs. The best way to deal with a problem in my life is not by identifying other problems around me, not even if those problems I believe are worse. In other words, the way to deal with a problem is not to identify a scapegoat, not to identify someone else that we can heap blame and attention on, but rather the way I respond to a mistake in my life is to appraise myself, correctly appraise myself, understand who I am and what I've done. Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, let each one test his own work. My job, my responsibility. I've got a log in my eye. That's what I need to see first. Each man should test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load. Galatians 6, 4 and 5 is saying exactly the same thing that Jesus was teaching in Matthew 7. That the first order of business is to deal with my own problems. The questions we ask ourselves when we have this kind of mindset is, am I wrong? Something has happened. Something isn't right. The first question should be, am I wrong? What might I have done? Here's even a better one. How can I learn and correct myself so that this doesn't happen again? That's the concept that Jesus is trying to get across here for his disciples and his followers. That it's hypocritical to be aware of everyone else's problems and ignore your own. That you're play acting, that you're not really godly at all. That you're not worried about your relationship with God, you're only worried about looking better than the people around you. Let each one test his own work. Listen, if I do a good enough job testing my work, I should catch most of my problems. And someone else isn't going to have to be worried about my speck. Let each one test his own work, And then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. I don't get to say, but I'm better than him. I'm too busy making corrections. This is exactly what he sees. Let's look at Luke's record of what Jesus taught. Luke chapter 6 and verse 42. How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck that's in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log in your own eye, you hypocrite? First take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take out the speck that's in your brother's eye. How can you say to your brother, here's his question, how can you do this? How can you say, let me take the speck that's in your eye out, when you don't even see the log in your eye? See, there's the first part of this, and that's what we have to focus on. Not looking past ourselves. Identifying my role, identifying my mistakes, identifying what I need to do to myself. And there's a proper attitude that comes along with this. When I see the log, when I see my problem, I need to make that problem personal. Again, the questions are, what have I done? Or what am I doing? Or what can I do about it? I think David actually is a great example here. You know the story of David and Bathsheba from 2 Samuel chapter 11. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, Nathan the prophet has been sent to David, and Nathan tells him a parable. And David realizes his sin. Took a lot. He recognized the evil of the parable. He had to be told that he was the subject of the parable. But once he realized that he was the subject of the parable, 2 Samuel 12 and verse 13, this is how it begins. David said to Nathan, I have sinned. He understood and made it personal. He didn't try to shift blame to Bathsheba. But she was naked. But she was taking a bath on her. I couldn't help myself. It's the circumstances' fault. I couldn't do anything about it. He didn't try to diminish his role. He simply said, I have sinned. He didn't try to spread the blame to others. You remember Joab? Joab shows up in this story. Joab is a confidant and a leader in the armies of Israel, and David, trying to cover up his sin, brings Uriah in and wants him to sleep with Bathsheba to cover up what he has done, and that doesn't work out, and so he finally decides he's just going to have to send Uriah out to battle and abandon him in the heat of the battle and let him get killed by the enemy. That's the only way that he can deal with this problem, and he calls upon his friend Joab to help him with that. He says, now you take him and you bring him out there and you find the hottest place in the battle, and then you have the troops withdraw from him there and let him fall, and then report back to me after this is done. David didn't say, you know something? I realize that we have sinned here. Bathsheba, She agreed to lay with me, and Joab agreed to help me. Joab should have told me no. Bathsheba should have told me no. He didn't do that. He didn't try to shift the blame. He didn't try to spread the blame to those who conspired with him to engage in these behaviors. He accepted responsibility for his sin. And there's what Jesus is getting at. How can you talk about the speck in your brother's eye when you don't even see your own problem? We have to make it personal. And then we have to see the true nature of what we've done. As I mentioned earlier, all too often we try to minimize our actions. We try to make them not look as bad as they really are. There are several ways that we can do that. We can talk about how bad things used to be, or how other people have done worse things, or point out the mistakes of others around us, or do any number of things to try to shift the focus or minimize what we've done. Going back to David in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 13, we see that is not at all what David did. Not only did David recognize his sin and accept personal responsibility for it, I have sinned, but then he said this, he said, I have sinned against the Lord. He understood something extremely important that we need to understand. Now, it's true that he had sinned against Bathsheba. If you read 2 Samuel 11 and 12 and you don't take away from it that David sinned against Bathsheba, you're missing something. What David did to her was wrong. He had sinned against Uriah, her husband. He had sinned against Uriah, her husband, before he ever brought Uriah back to Jerusalem. Before he ever brought Uriah back out to the battle and had him killed. He had sinned against Uriah the moment that he conspired to take Uriah's wife. He did all kinds of things against Uriah. He did all kinds of things against his own wife. You know, the one that he had married in his youth, that he should have loved and taken care of and met all the responsibilities of and been satisfied with. He had sinned against his own wife many, many times as he took other wives, committed fornication and various things that we know that he did. He had sinned against Bathsheba. He had sinned against Uriah. He had sinned against his wife. He sinned against Joab when he gave him orders to do stuff that was just immoral and wrong to do. He sinned against the nation of Israel. As the leader of Israel, those people deserved better from him. He had sinned against all of those folks, but ultimately he knew that he had sinned against God. He had sinned against the God who made us. He had sinned against the God who had made him king. He had sinned against the God who had protected and guarded him and brought him safely to that day. He didn't minimize his sin. He maximized and understood the nature of his sin. He said, I have sinned against the Lord. He didn't try to say, well, it was just Bathsheba. It was just Uriah. They're not even nobles. Uriah is not even a natural-born Israelite. Hope I'm remembering the story correctly. Believe he was a Hittite. He didn't say that. Well, Uriah's just a Hittite, and they don't really matter all that much. I just sinned against Uriah. No, he said, I have sinned against the Lord. He recognized the gravity of his sin. He recognized the seriousness of his sin. He understood that sin is a violation greater than just an offense against a human relationship. Sin is an offense against God. We would do well to remember this about sin. People do not deserve the consequences of our misdeeds and misunderstandings. People don't deserve it because of their genealogy, because of who their parents are, where they're from, what they look like. People don't deserve it because of their station in life, because they are not as important as I am, because they are under me. They're an underling. They're subject to me, and so I can mistreat them. No, it doesn't work that way. People don't deserve the consequences of my misdeeds because of their age. Well, it's just a child. Because of their size. They're smaller, they're weaker than me. Because of their past behavior. But look at all these things that this person's done. They deserved what happened. They got what was coming. No. People don't deserve the consequences of my sin. And every single offense reaches all the way to heaven. Truths usually cut two ways. And when Jesus said, when you've done it to the least of these, you have done it unto me, talking about doing good, you know what else that means? That means when we do evil, we've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. Our sins reach all the way to heaven. Much of what we call repentance falls short because we don't really make that connection. We don't really understand the gravity of what we've done. We don't make it personal. We don't grasp that it's against God. In many situations, we're quick to admit that we have sinned. Well, we've sinned. And again, it may be true that there are other people around who are complicit in it. There are other people around who are guilty. There are other people around who even did things that may have been the catalyst that made me act. But when I say we have sinned, what I'm doing is I'm talking about our collective guilt instead of talking about my sin and my personal guilt. David didn't say we have sinned. David said I have sinned. Did Bathsheba do something wrong? Did Joab do something wrong? It didn't matter to David, because David understood that he had done something wrong. We have to first take the log out of our own eye. Isn't that what Jesus said? How can you say you're going to help your brother with the speck that's in their eye when you don't even notice the log that's in your eye? The next statement from him, first, take out the log from your own eye. That's an ordinal statement. That's where it starts. That's where it begins. The problem begins with me. And me making certain that I deal with my own sins. And until I've addressed my personal sin, I must not even give thought to my brother. First, take out the log from your own eye, then you will see clearly. I'm not even fit to deal with my brother until I have first taken the log out of my eye. Also, we have to remember the nature and the extent of our sin is extremely important. We have to avoid downplaying the victim. Well, you know, it was only, and remember just how high every sin reaches. In Psalm 51 verses 3 and 4. Read these words. By the way, this is written by David, and it's believed by most that this is in response to his sin with Bathsheba and his awareness of his sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. That's where it starts. He makes it personal. I know my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. He also has appraised things appropriately with himself. I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. And then he says, against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. He says to God, after saying, I know my sin, against you I have sinned and done evil in your sight, and you are justified in your condemnation of me, and you are blameless in your judgment. How many people have you heard ask the question, how could a good and loving God send anyone to hell? Do you know what? The person that knows their sin and whose sin is ever before them understands that God is blameless in His judgment against us. That our sins are an affront and an offense to Him, and He is right and just in His condemnation and His judgment against us. It's not a matter of God sending anyone to hell. Our sins are taking care of that. What God is doing is rescuing those who turn to Him for help. Rescuing those who acknowledge their transgressions. Rescuing those who listen to His word. Rescuing those who find the protection of the blood of His Son. I know my transgression and my sin is ever before me against you, and you only I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. We need to understand that. We need to understand that every sin that we commit reaches all the way to heaven and is an affront to God, no matter how small we think it is. No matter how deserving we think someone might be worthy of the treatment. Well, I know I shouldn't have said that, but they did such and such. That sentence needs to stop with, I know I shouldn't have said that. We need to forever shun this tendency to worry about the sin in our brothers and excusing our own. We should try to identify what's wrong in ourselves. We should try to do what's within our own power to correct the problem within ourselves. What can I do to correct my own sin is first, and then how can I best resolve the issue with my brother? You notice the change in my language there. It's no longer against the sin that my brother has committed against me. It's how I can resolve the problem. I'm convinced that that's how God has dealt with man, by the way. That rather than look at the guilt of man, He has sought ways to resolve the relationship, to bring it back together, to solve the problem. Because He would be completely just in instantaneously removing our lives from the earth and casting us into eternal damnation. But He didn't do it. What can I do to correct my sin, and how can I resolve the issue with my brother? What solution can I find? Never looking to cast blame, we have to always seek the solution to the problem. Ways that things can be fixed, ways that things can be repaired. Look back at the language again. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye? This is Matthew 7:3. But do not notice the log that's in your own eye. How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. First obligation is to make certain that we mind our own selves and that we follow Jesus. You remember that exchange in John 21? I think it's around verse 22. And I believe that the players involved there, if my memory serves me correctly, are Jesus and Peter and John. And John has asked a question, and Peter has drawn the conclusion that what Jesus is saying is that John's going to live until the Lord returns. And in verse 22, he says, Jesus, that is, says to Peter, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? In effect, what he says is, that's none of your business. Why are you worried about that? Why are you worried about what I've said to him? You follow me. Our first obligation is to mind ourselves and to make certain that we have answered the call to follow him. And when we are doing that, we have a secondary obligation to very gently help others with their sins. Listen, if you're going to take a speck out of my eye, please be gentle. Don't go at it with a knife. Don't even go at it with your finger. Find something much more controlled and much more soft, because your help may do more damage than it cures. Galatians 6 and verse 1, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual, now there's the qualifier. You who have already taken the logs out of your eyes, you who have already made certain that you are following Jesus, you who are spiritual should, here's the key word, restore. See, it's not about judgment when it comes from us. It's about restoration. Restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. I love the end of this verse, because what it does is it says, don't ever lose sight of priority one. Even when you're doing priority two, remember to do priority one the whole time. Keep watch on yourself while you are restoring in a spirit of gentleness. Two words in there that are important. One of them we talked about already, restore. The second one, gentleness. It's got to be restorative and it's got to be gentle. That's what Jesus is teaching when he talks about beams and he talks about specks and he talks about eyes. It's not by chance that he used the eye, by the way. Listen, the eye, we know, is a very sensitive thing. Our eyes are aware of the smallest little pieces that get in them. Every once in a while, I'll get something in my eye, and I'll ask my wife, hey, I got something in my eye, can you help me find? She'll look around and look around and look around. I don't see anything. But you know what? I'm certain there's something there because I feel it. And yet here we are ignoring these huge problems in our own life while we're worried about somebody else's life, and instead of going in with good clarity and careful and cautious behavior, we're throwing around accusations and wreaking havoc and trying to take a dust speck out of a brother's eye with a shovel. When he says, restore them with a spirit of gentleness. A drop or two of saline will solve the problem. I don't need a jackhammer. We need to think about these things and become the kind of people that God would have us be. It's part of what it means to follow Jesus. It's part of how we become pleasing to him. Anything less than that is not good. Think about these things. Think about how they apply to your life. And going back to that scene that I said at the beginning, you're now part of that crowd. You have now listened to this, and you've listened to it not from me because I'm not all that important, but you've listened to it from Jesus. And ask yourself as you walk away from that crowd, how you're going to live different now that you know these things. If those